Please pray with me. Spirit of joy, Spirit of comfort, we pray for you to minister to us, your people, today. May only truth be spoken, may only truth be heard, we ask. Amen. You know, a lot of our lives are transactional. We might be working someplace where everybody has to get somebody a gift. And some people enjoy that, and some people just do it because you got to get the gift, right? And, there's acquaintances in our life. There's people I've played sports with I really wouldn't want to hang out with outside of sports, but I'm happy to play sports with them. We enjoy playing volleyball or whatever together. But real relationships are not transactional. Real relationships aren't rooted in, well, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. That's a transactional relationship. But real relationships that come out of kindness and love and respect and fairness, they are relationships that are there for one another through thick and thin, through the good times and the bad. I mean, good parents love unconditionally, right? Even when our kids are rats, even when they really drive us crazy, we're still there for them, right? And the same can be said for kids with parents. Sometimes parents drive kids crazy, but we can still be there for one another. And so we give thanks as spiritual people that we are blessed with gifts that are given to us unconditionally. So much of religion is about ministers and priests saying, now you got to do this to get this, you got to do that. So much of religion is transactional, but that mystery we call God isn't transactional. You didn't have to do a thing to be born. Your mom did, but you didn't have to. And we don't have to do anything to have these gifts of Advent visit us. We're going to get some hope sometimes. We're going to get some peace sometimes. We're going to get joy in our lives sometimes. And it's good to remember that because we can lose sight of the gifts of life amidst the struggle. One of the difficult things about life, my wife was telling me this, that our most vivid memories are the painful memories. And that comes from our evolution. I mean, when we were lower in the food chain and you saw somebody getting eaten by another animal, you didn't want to forget that, right? You needed to keep remembering the things that are a threat to you. And so they've put people on monitors and monitored their brain activity. And when people talk about the most painful things that have happened to them in their lives, their brain activity lights up more than when they talk about the happiest things in their lives. So what that tells us is we need spiritual practices to remember the positive, to remember the goodness, to claim the gifts. And really, that's what worship is a lot about. To come and put our troubles on the shelf for a moment and to realize, yes, life is beautiful despite its awfulness. Life is good and life is a blessing despite the struggle. And so today we're thinking about this incredible gift of joy. And there's no darkness so great, there's no light. There's no darkness so great that light cannot go through it. And we find humor and joy in the most dire of places, concentration camps, the Holocaust. I mean, in the Holocaust, people would still make jokes to lift one another's spirits. And they would get great joy when they'd fool the guards. Anytime you're in a concentration camp or some place where the authority figures are mean and cruel, there's great joy in outwitting them, getting one up on them. It's kind of how we survive those difficult times. And in risky work, I think the riskier the work, when people are working together, there's more joking. There's more humor, because you got to have that to keep you going. And what I'm familiar with is fishing and mining. And those are occupations which are very dangerous. And the people who do them, they're just carrying on all the time. I mean, they pay attention to their work, but they're always making, that's why Newfoundlanders are so funny. And Nova Scotians, we're pretty funny too. And when they'd leave the mine shift, they'd usually go to have a few drinks together just to let go of the pressure. and they'd have some drinks and they'd laugh and they'd carry on. Sometimes they'd get into fights, but they'd leave friends. It's just part of what we need to get through the rough times. We think of how awful war is, and we remember that at Remembrance Day and other times. But the flip side of the story is I've heard from people who've been in the war that that was among the best years of their lives, in the sense that they were closer to their mates than they ever felt close to someone before. And they did have times of blowing off steam and dancing and good times. And so war isn't just the awfulness. Anytime you find the awfulness of humanity, friends, you're going to find people who have moments of joy too. That's the great thing about Spirit and God and these gifts. You know, just the simple joys too that we take for granted, that maybe in earlier days when we didn't have the money we had today, we didn't take for granted. I remember it was a long, tough journey to my ordination. Staying in a residence when I could afford it, selling everything I had to pay the bills. And I remember I drove to Tupperville. They told me I was to go to Tupperville, and I couldn't even find it on the map. So I knew it was in Ontario, so when I get to Ontario, I bought an Ontario map, and sure enough, there was Tupperville, just north of Chatham, Ontario. And so it was pretty exciting because I'd never been there. Here I'm going as the new minister. I mean, that's joy, right? Accomplishment. Wow, this is so great. And so I went to the one little store in Tupperville, and I said, "Where's the manse?" And I said, "I'm the new minister." And so they pointed out where the manse was, and here, and I got in the manse, and I just sat on the floor, and I began to weep for joy. It's like, wow, I got a home now. I don't have to move, every time that the school term's over. And just the feeling of having that home and having my first opportunity to be a pastor, the joy was so great that I just cried. And so these are the things that we want to remember. And I encourage us maybe this week to do some time each day just thinking about great moments of joy in your life. And there's just so many simple pleasures. I mean, is there anything better than a great meal? I don't know you, I get cravings for different things, right? And when I got a craving for something, like I had a craving the other night for roast chicken. I mean, they have a roast chicken with my amazing dressing in it, right? And the gravy, oh my goodness. Like, it just, when I'm eating that, it's just like, this is as good as life's supposed to be, right? I mean, isn't it wonderful to have moments where life is as good as it's supposed to be? I mean, it might be brief, but they're great moments, and you just want to soak them in. I know a friend, and she gets the greatest joy out of going to her quilting group. Now, she can't go now, so we got that COVID thing, but she loves to get together and making quilts with her friends. And I know my son gets very excited when he wins. Last year he won the fantasy football pool. And honestly, that's as big as the Super Bowl in his life. And so we need to appreciate these things and give thanks for them. And I mean, isn't it great that we got vaccinations that are now approved and starting to come? I mean, just gives us a little lift, gives us a little joy where we can start to see that there's an end to this and that they're so effective. And again, I think I mentioned it last week, the average length of a vaccine, if it works at all, to develop is 4 years. And we've got them in 9 months because science is not only advanced, but scientists were working around the clock, sacrificing, seeing their families day after day after day. And we give thanks. And you can imagine the joy in their hearts when they discovered that this thing worked. I have a friend, and he's an accountant, but he loves music. He's gone to all the Junos, wherever they are in Canada, for years. And he's always sought out young talent to kind of support, to volunteer to be a mentor, to give them a business plan, to get them some recording and their first and their first CD. And he's gotten great joy out of that. But he's always had a dream that maybe one day one of the young artists that he helps would sign with a major label, right? And make it in the big times. And it's so cool that that's just happened this year. He's been working with a young country artist, and they're in the process of him signing with one of the largest labels in the business. And so that joy has come to him in the midst of a time when he's sad because his sister's dying. But that joy comes just out of the blue because the record producer had heard this fella and called him. And so he's got that to give him support during a difficult time. Now, one of my things that I love the most is being generous. I get a big bang out of helping people. And I'm thankful, the one thing in my background I'm really thankful for is growing up in our churches, we were always tithers. So when I got my first allowance, I was taught budgeting because I was taught to give 10% of it to the church. And when you first are taught that, when you get your first paycheck or your first allowance, it's never difficult. Like, it would kill most people if they were told you have to give 10% of your money to the church or to charity generally. I mean, most people just say, oh, my goodness, no. But if you've grown up doing it from day one, it's just what you do, right? So my kids, they're very generous too because they budgeted their first allowance and their first job, and that's just what we do. So it's easy, and it's fun. And I take 1% of my income just to do ridiculous tips. Because so many of the people who depend on tips, right? It's tough, tough, tough. And they often don't have enough money to make bills meet. So there's this one place, I'll call them out, the Black Walnut. And the owners are just, I don't know what to call them. Anyway, like when people buy stuff there, they say, well, can I give you a tip? And normally you can put it, like everybody's got plastic now. Nobody has cash anymore. But the owners won't adjust the system to allow for tips. And so they hardly get any tips. So one day, they got the best quiche, right? Oh, my goodness. And anytime I have their quiche, I have joy. I tell you. You can tell where I get a lot of joy. But anyway, so I went to the Black Walnut. I got my quiche, and I put $50 bill in the tip jar where they had just a few tips, right? And then my daughter works there. So the fun part, she didn't know it was me. She came home talking about how excited all the gals were about this $50 tip, right? And to be able to do that, and just to know they're going to be like happy about that for a couple of days. Like for a couple of days, all the problems that were driving them crazy are just going to seem a little lighter, right? And so these are things that we can do to generate joy. And I think it's so helpful, although most people don't realize it. It's so helpful to realize that the Christmas stories are all rooted in stories of danger and fear and poverty and jeopardy, into which angels intersect and interject with gifts of hope and peace and joy and love. Like if the Christmas stories were about somebody comfortable having a baby and, like maybe stories of kings and queens who have a baby, and it's all very exciting. But wow, what a great story that we've got a woman who, as a teenager, is pregnant. And let's be honest here. The earliest gospel is Mark. And Mark doesn't write any of these Christmas stories. These Christmas stories aren't history. They aren't facts. They're stories that tell us something about the meaning of Jesus' birth and what Mary went through. And so even the fact that this teenager had a child at that time, I mean, the reality is she was probably raped because every woman at that time was under the protection of their father. And nobody in those times could have had sex unless it happened in an untoward way, because the value of the woman in terms of a dowry and getting married was gone if she had sex. You know the old routine from back in the days. And so we're talking about people dealing with the worst of things personally and politically, with Rome being so brutal and cruel. And the reality is that childbirth and sexuality has always been a challenge and an incredibly painful part of women's existence. And women have been punished for their sexuality and shamed for their sexuality. And rulers and religious leaders do this to make us all guilty so they can control us. And women have been punished with shame for being married, unmarried, and having a baby, or abandoned by their partners. I had an aunt, and when she had her children, her husband was never around because he was drunk. And I know another woman, a good friend of mine. I mean, she was from a middle-class home. Her husband's a lawyer. He's a big deal at the church, elder. And when she phoned home to say that she was ready to come home with the baby, he said, "Oh, I'll take a taxi. I'm watching the hockey game." Right? And so we know these struggles and this pain. And a friend of mine, a good friend of mine from back in school days, she decided that she had to break up with her boyfriend, although she loved him, because she knew he was very selfish and he wouldn't be a good dad. And so she painfully went through that breakup and then discovered a month later that she was pregnant. And she wasn't prepared to carry that pregnancy to term. And so I went with her when she went to the hospital to get an abortion. It was a difficult moment for her. But what I thought was even the hardest part is that to this day, she hasn't been able to tell anybody, not her parents, not her closest friends, because of the shame. The shame that we have imposed on women through the centuries is cruel, cruel, cruel. And so thankfully, the head of our faith, Jesus, was born of a woman who knew all that, but was able to find the joy and claim her life as a gift. And so there is pain in the messiness of life, but the gift of joy also finds us there. And so Mary's visiting Elizabeth, who we learned about last week, who has this baby when she's old, and they support each other, and the angels come to them, and they find a way through. They find hope. And you know, these people that I mentioned, my aunt, she divorced her alcoholic husband. And she disregarded all the guilt and shame that was piling her, because that was way back in the day when if you got divorced, your church just abandoned you. It didn't matter really what label you were. And she had friends that wanted to dump on her, but she claimed a great life for herself. And she was a woman who was laughing all the time, especially about the absurdities of judgmental people. She had a great life. She was an incredible positive person. And my other friend developed a joyful, close relationship with that son she brought home by taxi. And she enjoys a relationship with her children that her husband will never have, because she is able to see the joy and the value and worth of relationships with our children. And my friend who had the abortion, she became an amazing teacher and coach, and eventually a principal. And she even won a provincial award as an educator because of the incredible influence she had. And she's lived a life filled with joy. I finished with a story that Sue told me when she came back from the Dominican. She went on a poverty awareness trip. And she went to a village where her heart just sank as she saw it. It was just mud huts that looked awful and no other facilities. It was like poverty she couldn't even have imagined. And yet, she was brought out of her kind of depression by the sound of peals of laughter and joy as kids came running out of the huts, playing and singing and dancing together, all excited that they had some people there coming to visit. And she just thought to herself, wow, in the midst of the difficult, darkest places, people still have joy. In fact, they had more joy dancing together than our kids had, because our kids are so self-conscious. We used to take youth troops to Cuba, and the Cuban youth would all be playing and dancing together, and they'd say, "Dance a Canadian dance," and all our kids would be just like... So Sue saved the day. She says, "Oh, okay, we'll do a Canadian dance. Let's do the hokey pokey." And so our kids are kind of doing the hokey pokey as best they can, right? Whereas the Cuban kids, they don't have that sense of self, critical self, because they need one another and they just enjoy one another. Final story, I was reading about a refugee camp in Honduras too. And the worker was from the United States, and she went for a year. And the poverty and the sickness and the challenge of it all just had her really depressed. And so one of the elders came to her around Christmas time and said, "You look very, very sad and upset. What's the trouble?" She said, "Well, I don't know how you do it. Like, it's just so hopeless. It's just so awful here." And he said, "You can afford to think that way. You can afford to feel that way because you're going to be going home to America soon." He says, "We're stuck here, so we don't have that luxury." So he says, when we create a refugee camp, he said, we create 3 committees: a property committee to work with the facilities, an education committee to do our best to give the kids an education, and a committee de allegro, a committee of joy. Because we got to dance. We got to have fun. We got to have good times. It keeps us sane. It keeps us on the road to where we want to go with our kids. And so, friends, that's the good news. This Christmas, as with every day of our lives, come what may, God's always got this committee of joy, sending us angels, sending us opportunities to be blessed and to be a blessing. And so let's journal our positive memories of joy, of pleasure, of blessing. Let's notice when joy comes our way. Let's not gloss over it. Let's not move to the next worry too fast. Let's slow down, soak in the joy. Let's enjoy it. Let's unwrap it. God's unconditional gift to Mary and to us.